This Photography News podcast is sponsored by MPB. There's never been a better time to make good use of your kit, inspire others, make some extra cash, and make a difference. Sell your used kit today at mpb.com/sell and let someone else love it as much as you have. In this episode of the Photography News podcast, Kingsley gets grumpy about snow, Will paints a windmill, and Roger witnesses the best sunrise ever. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Photography News podcast. My name is Roger Payne. I'm the editorial director at Photography News, and I've just realised that it's our 18th podcast, which presumably means that we can now go out and get drunk and generally do adult things as a result of turning 18. So in light of the fact that it's our 18th podcast, I thought that I would introduce my two colleagues based on their proximity to their 18th birthday. First, the very youthful Mr. Kingsley Singleton, contributing editor. Hi, Kingsley.
Hi. Yeah, I just had my 19th birthday.
Actually. Did you? So just 1 year ago that you turned 18. Really? Yeah. It's not. You're not looking that good for a 19-year-old, I have to say.
No, it was a heavy celebration.
Is that because you're not prepared to do the mental arithmetic to work out exactly when your 18th birthday was?
Or like, yeah, I am more like two 18-year-olds. In fact, I'm way more than two 18-year-olds or whatever.
Well, lovely to have you along. Slightly less useful, slightly less youthful, I should say, is editor of Photography News, Mr. Will Chung. Hi, Will.
Hi, Rog. Hi, Kingsley. I think you're being rather ageist here, Rog, because you are.
Well, I am. I mean, I could have done something about the football, but I've done the football before, and that would have just picked on Kingsley again. So I thought I'd start with 18th birthdays. It's a little while since your 18th, Will, right?
I just about remember it, to be honest. And I have got some way of a head start compared with both you and Kingsley.
Well, lovely to have you. Lovely to have you both along. We'll start, as always, by having a quick chat through what we've been photographing ourselves over the last couple of weeks. What about you, Kingsley? Have you managed to get much stuff over the last couple of weeks?
I didn't. So I didn't get what I'd normally do is go and try and make the most of the snow in the town where I live. But I've realised I'm a bit of a snow fascist, and I come up with reasons for not going out quite often. And one of the reasons is, so I did go out. I took my dog out and we had a walk in the snow. And I also did take some pictures of one of my dogs running around after it had stopped snowing. But I don't like shooting in the snow that much. Because I sort of prefer a sort of a less busy scene. I mean, there's a lot to be said for it. There's a lot to be said for, like, the recessions you get from it, the kind of the atmosphere that you can build from it. But personally, I just prefer to wait until it stops snowing. Wait till you got a bit of light, and ideally get out when no one else has messed up the snow, because again, my sort of tendencies being that I want this kind of pristine kind of snowfield. And that was the other reason I didn't go out and do any snowy town shots, was because by the time the light was nice the next morning, it had just been completely ruined by other people going out and having fun in it. So I'm against fun and against other people enjoying the snow until I've enjoyed it.
Were you not, before we started recording, lamenting the fact that there were far too many people out trying to take pictures with their camera phones and ruining it for you?
I was a bit conflicted by it. I think I don't know. There was a certain sort of spontaneous joy to it, I suppose. And actually, during the lockdown, despite all the things that some people would probably be thinking and posting online about how people shouldn't be going out and sledging and things, in a way, I totally understood why the park was full, and people were being kind of distant and stuff, really, and it was kind of like, it was, and you sort of think like it is a joyful situation, isn't it?
It's marvelous.
Bit of snow.
So are you quite so grumpy about snow, Will, or did you actually make the most of the fact that we had quite a heavy snowfall?
No, I don't think Kingsley's overthinking this, as per usual. I mean, the other day when it started snowing, I was out there. I was there with bells on. I mean, it was wonderful. I mean, it was, of course, it was cold and windy and the snow was falling quite heavily, but that's part of the fun and the challenge, I think, of taking pictures. So I took oddly enough, I took a leaf out of Kingsley's book, and I took out my Z7. I fitted the longest lens I had with that camera, which is actually a Nikon 70-300 with an FTZ adapter. And I went out and shot virtually everything on a 300mm lens. You get an impressionistic feel, and I was shooting at slow shutter speed, so I got lots of blurry snow in there. And it's wonderful. I just walked to the local hill. There were a few people about. There were a few people taking selfies. But I have a project, as we talked about in the last podcast, I have a project on people shooting selfies. So people shooting selfies in the snow was like, I was there with bells on. As I said, it was wonderful. The only problem I had was just, the logistical stuff of snow on the lens. It's like rain on the lens. So I did have a lens cloth to keep the thing dry and wipe it down. But I must be honest, I didn't have enough lens cloths effectively, because once one got saturated, I was just getting some smeary pictures. But that was part of the fun of it. It's gorgeous.
See, that's the reason I don't do it. It's because I don't want to be spending ages kind of like trying to keep my camera dry. I just want to be kind of, contemplating the forms of the landscape.
But you don't spend ages. That's the thing. I mean, I have a book coat on like we all do when it's snowing. I stuffed the lens down the front, came out, took a few pictures, put it back. I took a spare battery because I thought it might be, the battery might drain quickly because of the cold, but didn't need it. And I shot a load of pictures. And then, Kingsley's right, of course, there is opportunity when the snow settled. So the following morning, I went out again and the sun was out, and there were loads of people down the local hills tobogganing, lots of kids and families out, all social distancing. And I'll tell you what, people were just really friendly. The sun was shining. And every time I walked past somebody, it was like, morning, lovely day. And I thought it was great. It was, so I had two extremes of snow, and I'm certainly not as grumpy about snow. And I think the opportunity is not as regular as it used to be. I made the most of it, and I suggest our listeners and our readers do the same.
Well, I was going to make that point, Will, about the fact that it's been a while since we've had a reasonable snowfall. I mean, unfortunately, where I am, we haven't had much of it. We haven't had a solid sort of 3 or 4 inches or anything like that. We just had a very light dusting. But no, I mean, it doesn't come around very often, does it? So people should get out and try and make the most of it, right?
Yep, I'm with that completely.
One of my methods of keeping people away from me when I'm out in the snow is literally to take the dog out, this sort of enormous snow bastard running around. And that's what I did. And so, I did enjoy that. And it sort of reminded me, though, of the kind of thing. There's one of the big things about shooting, particularly trying to get fast shutter speeds in snowy conditions, is that because the camera thinks it's super light, and you then have to sort of adjust your exposure. You need to overexpose slightly to keep the snow light. Your shutter speed then gets lower. So you have to be very careful to kind of, if you want to freeze movement, you have to be quite careful to kind of keep that in mind. Otherwise you get a load of blurry snow dogs.
So despite the introductions, Kingsley, and despite the fact you are the closest to you're the closest of the three of us to your 18th birthday, you are definitely the grumpiest of old men when it comes to getting out and making the most of beautiful weather conditions.
It's because I'm slap bang in the middle of that midlife crisis, right?
But of course, well, I didn't make, as I've already said, the weather where I was meant that we didn't get too much snow. And actually, over the weekend, when the snow kind of was falling, I was busy doing car maintenance, so it's probably not the best time to get out and take pictures. But that said, I did get out this morning, very early this morning, usual dog walk, standard stuff, and I think I can safely say that I witnessed the most spectacular sunrise that I have ever seen. I would attempt to show you on the back of the camera, but it's not probably not great for a podcast. But it was one of those sort of things where you sort of look through the horizon and it is just the brightest of reds, that sort of real intense redness. And I sort of quickly sort of half slid, half ran to get to a particular vantage point up in the fields near where I am. And it was just absolutely incredible. It was proper take your breath away stuff. I had my little faithful X100S with me, took some pics on that, and I'm actually going to put these up on Instagram because literally 5 minutes after I'd got those shots, the sky was as dull as anything. It was grey and overcast, and it was just incredible to think that, you know, literally 5 minutes sooner it had been the most wonderful sort of sunrise. So yeah, it's I didn't make the most of the snow, but I definitely tried to make the most of that sunrise. So
and did you have to employ any particular settings for that, or sort of approach wise?
no, I mean, I just what I've done is I generally meter off the actual sort of brightest parts of the sky. So a lot of the foreground will actually underexpose, and then I'll tend to bring it back a little bit in Lightroom. But generally speaking, it's all about getting detail in the sky and in the stunning sort of red of the morning. By the time this podcast comes out, the snow probably will have disappeared. As we were discussing before we started recording, it is now rather slate grey and heavy rain, which will probably be washing all the snow away. We thought we'd turn our attention to the great indoors. Obviously, the lockdown is still in full effect in the UK. So we thought we'd turn our attention again to some ideas for things that you could create inside. And Will, I'm going to come to you first because you were chatting about an interesting technique that you've been trying. Am I right in saying it's something called blood painting?
Yes, indeed, absolutely spot on. It was a technique, and you know, I know nothing in this world is original, but it's a technique I found on YouTube, which I spend watching a lot of nowadays. And there's a website, a channel there called Another Perspective. And I think it's a young German lad, but anyway, he had this technique which involved nothing more than an LED torch. And basically what you do is have this LED torch, and you turn it on and you rest it against your fingers or even your palm of your hand. And these bright LED torches nowadays are so powerful, it kind of actually glows through the structure of your fingers. So I know this is a podcast, but I'll give you an example. Look, fellas, here's the torches on, and I'm resting my two fingers against it. As you see through the webcam, it's glowing red.
It looks like, just to describe it for the listeners, it looks like ET's chest.
That's exactly what I was thinking. It's an ET glow. Yes.
Yeah, so exactly what it is. And so I did some light painting with this technique, and I mentioned the guy on the YouTube, and he did this thing with a lens ball and a mirror. So I just did exactly the same thing. I happened to have a lens ball. I took the mirror down from the living room wall, and I sat myself up and did it. And it was dead simple. I mean, it's great fun to do, very unpredictable, and you have to have various goes at it, because when you start light painting, unless you're really disciplined, what you find is, as I'm showing you now, guys, is my fingers part a little bit and a bit of white light comes out. So I had quite a few failures, but actually it also added to the effect. So basically what I did was I laid the mirror down, gave it a good clean, put the lens ball on it with a little holder so the lens ball didn't roll away, set the camera up on self-timer, focused up obviously on the lens ball, fired the self-timer. I had 10 seconds to get around, did a 30-second exposure, and from the other side of the lens ball facing the camera lens, I just waved my hand around with my fingers over the torch.
I'm hearing a lot about this lens ball. So talk to me about this lens ball. Is this like from the same Amazon catalogue as your Dutch paw and your kind of...
You see, despite the fact that you're both younger than me, you're both old farts in this regard. It's
older lally.
Lens balls are very popular amongst young photographers who like to take these things out, and they do it in front of bright lights or in famous monuments, and they have the thing held up, and you know, it's a wonderful ball, only about 25 quid, I think.
I've seen the results of this blood painting, and I was quite impressed by it. But what I'm now wondering is, what comes next? What other parts of your body are you going to illuminate with a torch? And
that would be telling.
Yeah, we are. Mind you, we are an over 18s podcast now, so I think we could probably. So just so I'm really clear, Will, just so I can really understand this technique. So you've got it all set up, and you've got your camera locked off on a tripod. You set the self timer. Are you in a completely dark room as well? So you switch all your room lights off, so there's no stray light.
Yes, and you have to do all things like, as I found, for instance, most of us have got things that glow in the dark. It might be a screen, or it might be a TV, LED, or it might be, you might get some street light coming, wherever it might be. And I did have to go around, I did a couple of test shots, and then have to go around turning things off. So even like, for instance, your mains, which have got these glowing red LEDs, they all pick up. So you have to kind of work and I mean it's not too difficult, but you have to kind of work that out. Obviously, you have to darken room, and you need a torch which is it's one of these LED torches, so they're very bright. They don't give them much heat, which is important. And just push this against your finger, and you can try different things. So I got different effects. For instance, when I had the torch up against the palm of my hand, so the light was very faint, but then it got much brighter towards the tips of my fingers, and then just tried painting different patterns.
Things like you were saying, things like reflections are also important in this, aren't they? And like minimizing, so like when people are light painting outdoors, they try to wear black clothing, and is that important? Or I'm imagining you in some sort of ninja suit or kind
of. No, I was in my gym jams actually, Kingsley. So you don't have to have any ninja suit, but of course it's part of the fun. And I use the reflections off this mirror. The thing I found, you just have to practice the movement, because you have to transcribe, for instance, a circle or lines, or and you also have to do things like when you're moving a torch about, not smack into the lens ball and send it rolling down the mirror, which I did once. So you kind of practice a few times, but because it was fun and each one took 30 odd seconds and then like 10 seconds to reevaluate and shoot again, you could do quite a few in a short period of time, and you're doing it indoors as well, so you don't get cold or anything.
Saying about movement, I definitely think that's one of the most important things in shots like that, because that is like a big dividing factor between stuff that looks good and stuff that doesn't look good. When you have kind of it's like having smooth traffic trails, isn't it? Or like a smooth beam of a torch painting a tree outdoors or something like that. You want that. You don't want kind of these kind of jarring kind of elements to it. I mean, unless that's what you're going for. If you're going for like a sort of a fuzzy kind of effect, obviously that's fine. But like if you're after something that looks quite kind of cultured and sort of regular, you need that kind of that smooth kind of movement.
You do. And I think so. I mean, we've done I've done blood painting, but of course, if you've just got an LED torch with some coloured filters, you can do them blue, green, whatever colour you want to do. So that's only because it was convenient and fun. I've never done it before, and I was inspired by a YouTube guy.
I think ultimately it's like it's a really nice way of spending an evening, by the sounds of it, Will, in terms of just indulging in a bit of photography, having a bit of fun, and getting some nice results out of it. And certainly looking at the image that you sent round to the two of us before we started recording, it looks really, really fun, really effective as well. So we'll get that picture. I'm sure you'll put it on your own Instagram feed, Will, but I'm sure we'll also get it up on the Photography News Instagram feed, a reminder of which is the handle is @PhotoNewsPN. We did also touch, chaps, a little bit on just general sort of things that you can do in terms of camera movement. And Kingsley, you were talking about a technique where you just sort of stick an ND on the front of your camera and kind of walk around and set the exposure going and walk around. You could walk around your house, I guess. You could walk around the local street or something, couldn't you?
Yeah, within your sort of allotted area of lockdown regime or whatever. It's something I did a few times on kind of going on city breaks and on travel sort of around the world and stuff. And kind of sometimes when light isn't great or you're not sort of doing anything else, I would just kind of put an ND on the camera, set like a 30-second exposure, and just sort of move down a street. And you can get some quite interesting effects. Obviously, you don't need to keep the movement in one direction. You can kind of spin around and stuff like that. I mean, it sort of chimes a little bit with like when people do those long exposure pictures in forests where they tilt the camera down. I think you can have an awful lot of fun with just kind of intentional camera movement, and it doesn't matter where you are. You can be indoors, you can be outdoors. It's ultimately it's just about sort of trying to make something that's pleasing for yourself, and things that are surprising are pleasing often. So just seeing what you can get can be as worthwhile as working towards some kind of particular defined end goal, I think.
Absolutely. And Will, you also mentioned about throwing your camera around with the shutter open, which sounds slightly risky, but what's that entail?
Well, it's the same idea as Kingsley just mentioned. You're just moving the camera during a longish exposure, and you're throwing the camera up in the air and obviously catching it. Suggest you don't use your latest pride and joy, maybe your second body or something, and it's completely unpredictable. And things like DCM, the deliberate camera movement, it's a huge movement again amongst the the younger photographers who tend to be more experimental. And certainly things like dragging your shutter, when you're doing trees and things like that, it's great fun, and it is unpredictable, but it gives you something a bit fresh and a bit more interesting when you're out there shooting. So it makes the most of a scene you might see all the time. Just try long shutter speed and do a drag.
So, well, that's some good stuff. Obviously, we can't be held responsible if you do choose to throw your camera in the air and it comes to
from your torch.
Yeah, absolutely. But some nice ideas there. But what about you, Kingsley? You were talking about something, a little technique that you'd been trying, going back, revisiting some old pictures and creating some similarly sort of painterly artistic effects. What were you doing?
Yeah, this is actually, I can't remember why I thought about doing this again, but when I did, I remembered a conversation that we'd had years ago about a photographer called Jason Schulman, who does long exposure images of films. I mean, he does lots of things, I guess, but that seems to be what he's kind of most notable for. And actually, Rog, I think you brought my attention to him, and I ended up buying one of his prints off his website. I was so impressed by these things, and it was a print of 2001. And what he'd done is, apparently, the way it's described is that he'd set up the camera, pointed it at the TV, and basically done like a long exposure through the entire film. And what you get is this kind of very indistinct, impressionistic image at the end. But you get certain elements within it that actually kind of make you think, yeah, because I think in that picture you can sort of see how the computer, you can see his light in the middle, and you can just about make it out, So if you know what it is, you know what it is. Anyway, this technique can be done in lots of different ways. You don't have to do it as a single exposure. And what I've been doing is I've been taking pictures that I'd shot years and years ago, again on travels and things, and layering them all up in Photoshop, and then using blending to create a sort of a median or a mean version of them. And obviously what that means is you get essentially like multiple exposures. So if you were to go around and use the multiple exposure mode on your camera, you shot 3 pictures, a picture of a house, picture of the sky, picture of a texture, you would get a certain effect. This is 10 pictures, 20 pictures, 30 pictures. And what that does is it drives away a bit the kind of the distinctness, and what you're left with is effectively sort of texture and color. And again, things that sort of give you an impression of that place. So I did some shots, I did some versions of it from various woodlands that I've shot in around the UK as part of a woodland project that I was doing. And I did one of Death Valley, and I did one from Palermo, and kind of just, it was one of those things, a bit like you were saying earlier about, just a fun way of spending some time. Actually, you get quite absorbed by it.
It also, did it not, prove that you had a massive, great bit of dust on your sensor?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. It's a very good way of discovering sensor dirt, because if you've been shooting the same thing over and over again, you've got some blob. Obviously, that is going to be in the same position on the sensor no matter what you're shooting, and you can then see it. And there was something enormous. Was that from Palermo? I can't remember.
I think that was the Palermo one that you sent through. But I mean, the effect was really strong, though. I mean, it's quite abstract. Well, it's very abstract, isn't it? There's no sort of obvious forms or. I mean, there, as you say, there's sort of like silhouettes and outlines of things that. But I suppose that really depends on how many images you start to combine together, doesn't it?
Yeah, completely. So if you're shooting with 5 pictures, you can get something that looks, creating the thing with 5 pictures, you can get something that looks a bit, sort of maybe a bit of a mess, actually, because it's going to be a bit uncoordinated, and it's going to be like a bit of a jumble of lines and things. But the more pictures you put in, the more it turns into this kind of calmer kind of texture. But there are other things you can do with it. Like if you want to have more of a focal point, you can sort of add one of the pictures back in as a sort of a different layer to this thing, and then you can just mask that back in a little bit more kind of strongly, so there's a bit more of a focal point to it. I mean, again, I'll put some of these things on the PN feed so people can see what we're talking about. But the way I do it is using smart objects in Photoshop, and that is obviously only available in the full version of Photoshop. But what you do is you put in your 20 layers, you highlight them in the layers palette, you select them all, then you convert it to a smart object, and then you have to do something. You have to change what's known as the stack mode, and there's about 10 or 12 options in stack mode, and most of them are completely useless for this, but mean and median are the options that you want, because they create the average.
And what are they averaging? Are they averaging sort of tone or exposure or everything?
I'd love to give you a technical answer to that, Rog.
Well, can I have a technical answer, please?
You may not. I'm just going to say they're averaging everything. It's literally kind of like I mean, what you do notice is that things like very strong contrast comes through. So like some of the pictures from Death Valley, there were some road signs, and they're obviously much higher contrast than a desert background, and you can see them. But I mean, you can do it manually. Like if you go into Photoshop and you layer up 4 layers and you change the opacity on them manually, you can get the same effect. It's just that when you've got 50 layers, it makes sense to do it in a more sort of automated, more automated way. The last thing I do to them is probably crop them square, because as everyone knows, square means art, doesn't it?
It does indeed, and I'm slightly disappointed that you don't have a deep knowledge of Photoshop algorithms. I'm not really sure that you can call yourself a photojournalist anymore. Really,
Yeah, I rarely call myself that anyway.
Right, that's very true. Okay, so there's some nice ideas there if you want to get a bit abstracty and a bit sort of creative from a long exposure perspective. But what will about if we just wanted to do something that was a little bit more simple, perhaps using stuff that was already in the house or lights that were already in the house? You mentioned about photographing food. Now, we're not talking about photographing it for a sort of a cookbook or something like that. You had a more sort of simple idea. What was that?
Well, my simple idea was just taking a leaf out of Edward Weston's book and portfolio, and he did all these wonderful black and white studies of things like aubergines and peppers and onions. And I think you can just raid the if you have such a thing, a larder for the veg, and just take some pictures, and or go to the supermarket and rather than buy the pristine carrots or whatever, go for the wonky ones because they're a bit more characterful. Or in the right time of year, you can buy the veg with still, for instance, with carrots, still with the plant on top, and they're really quite photogenic. Now, obviously, this time of year, you don't get stuff like that, but I would go find some peppers or something like that to photograph, and you can just use window light, camera on the tripod, some soft light, maybe a dark background, a sheet of dark card, or even a black T-shirt, for instance, and explore what you can do with veg. And it's such a simple idea. You can get some real original stuff out of it too.
Yeah, I seem to recall thinking about the Western pepper in particular. It is about the way it's lit and the background that it's sitting on, that really sort of brings it all together. So I guess it's also an opportunity for people to play around with not only daylight, but also maybe some artificial light, maybe a sort of something as simple as like a desk lamp, or even even using a torch, and just seeing how moving that around on a subject can affect it, and then maybe throwing in reflectors. It's a good opportunity generally, isn't it, to learn about how light affects a subject.
It's a good idea for a project as well. Do a theme of pictures like this and make a montage in Photoshop afterwards, and make a print and stick it on the wall. I think it's a great thing to do. And you can also try this, of course, if you've got a light pad, or you can use a tablet. Cut some of the veg and fruits up thinly enough so that light comes through. Obviously, you have to cover your tablet with some cling film so you don't ruin it. But just thinly slice an orange or grapefruit or red onion, put it on your tablet, and again, just photograph it from above, and just explore that. I mean, there's different ways of having a go at this subject.
It's a good opportunity to work with colour or black and white as well, kind of working out what suits those kind of subjects best, and and equally sort of applying that to your setup. So like if Will's kind of, if we concentrate on Will's wonky carrot, like if you shoot that against like a kind of a bluish slatey kind of background, then you're going to get like a really nice contrast between warm orange and cool kind of background and stuff. And if you can't do that, then and it's more about texture and tone, then then maybe you shoot in mono and you kind of do it that way.
And Kingsley, I know you were going to mention about you're a particular fan of, just to give another idea before we move on, and you're a particular fan of flat lay stuff, aren't you? Now, this is a very youthful technique, is it not? Where you pick a sort of a series of subjects and lay them on a flat surface and then photograph them from above. This is something that obviously you've got quite into, correct?
I do. I haven't done as much of it as I kind of would like to have done, really. Like now you put it like that. I mean, it's like, I think it's a great excuse for having a rummage around, finding objects that work together, and sort of, just losing a few hours looking through your viewfinder and seeing how you can kind of compose these things. I mean, it's not the most technical sort of approach to photography. It doesn't have to be. You're setting up a camera pointing straight down, and you want to kind of make sure that it is pretty much flat on, hence the name. Otherwise, you're not going to get that effect. You may want to experiment with kind of the focal length that you're using, because obviously the wider you shoot, the more difficult it's probably going to be to create a cohesive sort of composition. And obviously, the larger the objects that you're going to have to use. But like, again, it's an opportunity to sort of have a look around the house, look for backgrounds, look for objects, look for kind of interesting kind of compositions that you can make, contrasts in color and tone and things like that. And again, it's kind of, if you can do it thematically, I think that's the best way to approach it.
So having a theme, obviously really important, but also I've always thought with flat lays that probably the most important thing is actually the background that you stick everything on.
Yeah, and I think that's why kind of people that are into that sort of thing, and people that are into still life in general, will probably have a little collection of backgrounds that they like to use, and they'll also have a bunch of tricks up their sleeve for things to do to those backgrounds, whether it's about wetting them, or even just making sure they're clean, or it might be having a slate but putting a piece of glass over the top of it, or even like Will says, it might be about shooting on top of a laptop screen or something like that. But yeah, it is a really important part of it.
Anything to add, Will, from the flat lay perspective?
The flat lay fraternity.
One thing I did before Christmas, strange enough, not flat lays as such, but I was photographing flowers on my light pad, which is this thin light LED light I've got. And one thing I decided to do was to make my own alphabet using flower petals. So it's not quite the same as flat lays, but it's kind of an offshoot of it. And I made my own alphabet with flower petals. The long-winded nights just flew by. What I did was why I did this was to make my own personalised Christmas card, or Christmas card from the Chung family. So I actually made my own alphabet with flower petals.
I think like it's worth mentioning, like, along with the fruit and veg and the flowers and stuff, it's going to sound pretty dark now, decomposing flowers, dead flowers, I find way more interesting than live flowers.
Do a time lapse as well as they die. That sort of thing. That could be great fun.
Excellent.
I mean, not when I'm giving them to my wife. Get like a slap across the face, wouldn't you? But
well, hopefully there's loads of ideas there. I mean, I think we could probably keep on going with various different techniques, but there's some new stuff for you to try there. Plenty of ideas. Obviously, if you do have a go at one or many of the techniques that we've just discussed there, we would love to see the results that you get. The best way to get in touch with us is to use our email address, which is podcast@photographynews.co.uk. And before we move on, I'll just put a little mention in here for a gentleman called Trevor Rudkin, who got in touch with us using that very email address. And he said, I just wanted to say how much I'm enjoying your podcasts. I was a bit late in beginning to listen to them, but in 3 days, I've listened to all 17 on your website. It's like having 3 photographic mates in the room chatting away while I process some images. That's rather nice. Thank you very much for that, Trevor. That's a nice endorsement. I think that's kind of like the vibe we were trying to get across. But obviously, in real life, we all hate each other, so it's quite nice that we're coming across as photographic mates. This Photography News podcast is sponsored by MPB. Use their free online valuation tool to instantly find out exactly how much your gear is worth. Get super fast payments straight into your bank account, and if you change your mind at any point up until you get paid, they'll ship it back for free. So moving on, Will, why don't you? I think you're just in the process of sort of starting to put the next issue of PN together. So any particular highlights that listeners can look out for?
Yeah, absolutely. As you say, we're starting the next issue. We're actually halfway into it. I have been testing the new Nikon, the Nikon Z7 II. So there's a review on that. We also have some book excerpts from a book called Nature, 52 Assignments. And we've got a couple of interviews by the authors in there. The authors are Ben Hall and Ross Hodnott, who are both well-known wildlife professionals. And I was asking them about what they've been doing for the last few months during lockdown. But the Nikon is the main review. We've got lots of news. We've got lots of hot news on the Fujifilm launches that have just happened, including an incredible medium format camera, or what Fujifilm called large format camera. And that's the GFX 100S. But 102 megapixel camera. And it's £5,500 for the body, which I know is still a hideous amount of money. But for that number of megapixels, for that money, it's just incredible value. And the other new camera from Fujifilm I was going to just highlight was the XE4, because I'm a big fan of the XE3, which I use an awful lot for my street work. So to see an XE4 come out, that's very exciting too.
On the next podcast, episode 19, we've decided that we are going to have a bit more of a detailed roundup about, new kit launches. As Will's alluded to there, we've obviously seen the new stuff from Fujifilm. There's also some new cameras from other manufacturers as well, which we'll chat about on the next podcast. So we'll give you our opinions and have some thoughts about those then. Moving on, it's time to answer some reader questions. All these questions have been sent to podcast@photographynews.co.uk. The first one is a question that's going to go to our podcast sponsors, the guys at MPB. And this is a question from Dave C that he sent in on email, which is, it's the new year. And he said, it's time to buy myself a new camera. I've decided to take photography more seriously this year. So I'd like to ditch my compact and get a good quality starter kit, either mirrorless or a DSLR. I've got a £500 budget for camera and lenses, no brand loyalty, and thought I'd buy used so I can get the best value. What would MPB recommend? So we put this to the guys at MPB, and this is what they came up with for an answer.
Well, really interesting. Thank you for your inquiry. Yep, the £500 kind of segment is really interesting, as there's quite a bit of choice there, both in DSLR and mirrorless. This time we've opted to go for a mirrorless setup, simply because it seems to be kind of the technology that most manufacturers are spending kind of the most money on. So it seems to be where the kind of industry is going for the future. So we've decided on a Fujifilm X-T10, a fantastic camera. It's extremely compact and very, very light. So even though it is probably bigger than your compact, it's not a penalty that you'll really, really feel like, for example, if you're going for a full frame DSLR or something like that. One of the key things that Fujifilm do with cameras in their mid-range is they keep them very, very light and very portable. So you don't really feel like they're a hindrance to you carrying it, as part of your everyday. So either on your shoulder, around your neck, or even just thrown in your bag. They're very, very sturdy, made out of metal. So you can trust that they're going to stand the test of time, shall we say. Image quality is amazing, as per Fujifilm. They make them very usable, and the images look amazing straight out of the camera. They put a lot of work into the color science, so you can be sure that the images will look amazing straight out of the camera. They have an amazing selection of lenses as well. Mainly in the primes, they seem to have a bigger selection of prime lenses, and we were recommending getting the 27mm, which in full frame terms is more like a 35mm, I would say. So great for all-purpose photography. And the reason we've chosen a prime is if you're kind of going up from a compact and onto more manual settings, or a camera that kind of gives you more manual options, it's great to kind of kind of understand how the cameras work. Becoming familiar with one focal length allows you to really understand kind of composition and I guess how that particular focal length works. If you don't like it, you can always go down and go wider, or go up and go a bit tighter. So something like a 25mm or 24mm, or maybe a 50mm, depending on kind of what you find. But we find that a 35mm equivalent is a great middle ground. So those two can be had for the XT10 in excellent condition is £214, and the 27mm lens can be had in excellent condition for £209. So a little bit of cash left over there for an accessory like a strap or even some filters. Alternatively, you could always go for a zoom lens, something like a 16-50, which has a variable aperture of f3.5 to 5.6, and that can be had for £169, so even a little cheaper there. The 27mm, whilst doesn't zoom, it will offer you better quality in terms of the absolute image quality, but obviously you're doing away with the flexibility of having a zoom lens. So something to think about there. Good luck.
So hopefully that's helpful for you, Dave. Moving on to the next question. We've kind of touched on this technique a little bit already in this podcast, but maybe we can talk a little bit more about it from an outdoors perspective. It comes from a chap called Larry, who sent it in on the email address, and he says, I'd like to have a go at painting with light. Can you give me any tips? So where to start with this then, Will? I mean, assuming that obviously he's got the camera locked off on a tripod and he's got the shutter locked open, any particular advice that you could pass on to him in terms of how to go about it?
Oh God, I mean, where'd you start? I mean, one thing just to say about this subject is that it can happen, but obviously you going around shining a bright light at a building or flashing a building can draw attention to oneself. So that's one thing just to say, that if you are going to do this, just consider the building that you're photographing. But I mean, decide how you're going to do it. You can use a flash gun or you can use a torch. My preference nowadays is for a torch. The flash guns, I used to use were great, but I found the torch is much more controllable. So we mentioned already, but I've got one of these powerful LED torches, and you can get ones which are really powerful into the thousands of joules, with 4 or 5 LEDs on the front. They're daylight balanced. They're not hideously expensive. They're very efficient on battery, and they're very powerful. And when I was up in Norfolk, obviously way before lockdown, I was at Horsey, where there's a well-known photographic windmill there, owned by the National Trust, I think. And I was photographing in the sunset. It got dark, and I thought, "What the hell? I've got the torch in the bag." And even from, I must have been a good 100 yards away, I got my torch out and I started painting the windmill. And funnily enough, I bumped into another photographer. This other photographer came over and said, "Well, I'm painting with light." And he said, "All right," and he had a torch as well. So he set up his camera, and the two of us painting this windmill from, like I said, from 100 yards distance. And the things about it is it's a practice, try and get an even lighting effect. So move it around, keep it moving, so you don't get a hot spot, and just try different exposures. It's quite fussy. It is quite, to get a good result, you do have to practice a little bit more. If you are going to use flash, again, that's one of those things. You might think your flash is very powerful, but actually, when you take it out into the great outdoors, flashes are really quite puny. So be prepared to give lots of blasts in manual. Have some spare batteries because you can need them. And when you walk around the scene with a flash gun, just make sure the back of the flash gun is covered up, because there's an LED panel on the back often, because they can pick up as you walk around. So.
And equally, the other thing I was going to add in with flash and remembering years and years ago doing this technique running around a churchyard is the fact that you can get the technique absolutely spot on and then realize that because you've stood in between the camera and the flash gun, you can suddenly appear in a silhouette, which can actually ruin the whole effect. So you need to try and sort of hold the flash gun to one side, so you're not effectively obscuring the light as such. So yeah, covering up the LCD is really important, but also making sure that you're not standing in the way of the two. What about you, Kingsley? Have you got anything to add to this? I take it you're probably more of a torch man than a flash gun man when it comes to this technique.
Torchman.
Torchman, yes, indeed.
I think
Superhero.
like Will was saying, like the difference between it's like you almost want to kind of go down one route or the other and practice and perfect it. And arguably using a flash is slightly more expensive if you don't have a flash, but most people would have a torch, and arguably fractionally more complicated in terms of exposure. But I think my kind of basic tip would be to sort of just practice. And like Will was saying about getting smooth kind of strokes of light painting on the subject, all those things really do make a difference when you come to actually finding a subject that you're like Will's windmill there, that you're dead keen on and you want to make really good use of. All that time that you've spent kind of working on that technique will actually kind of pay off. So personally, what I would like to do if I was painting a windmill or something is have enough natural light still in the scene and just pick out the windmill a bit, quite subtly. But obviously, you can have it in complete darkness, and then you can almost do like a kind of a spotlight effect. But I would definitely say that those elements of practice, working out like particularly how long you might need to paint something. Large objects take longer to paint. It seems obvious when you say it, but until you actually do those things, you don't necessarily kind of think of them.
Yeah, one of the things I was going to mention as well is obviously, we're assuming at the moment that, Larry wants to go out and photograph things like buildings or larger objects. I suppose there's also, if you wanted to photograph something, slightly smaller, something like a car or something like that. I seem to remember, Kingsley, that some time ago you went out with a photographer who used like a bar, like an LED bar. I think it was a Westcott ice light, and you sort of move that over the subject.
Yeah, and again, that was very kind of success in that was a lot of that was down to him knowing that he could move this bar. He could hear the click of the shutter, or, he knew when the exposure was starting. And at that point, he was moving with the bar. So he didn't get like a hot spot of light where the bar was shining too long on a certain bit, and then he brought it over at a smooth motion. And that was, and then he kind of managed to kind of get the light out of the frame by the time the exposure ended. So again, you're not left with a kind of like a bit of the car or something that isn't kind of properly lit up. I would say that kind of coming from a sort of a camera and Photoshop background like I do, I don't think there's anything wrong with locking off your camera as you would do anyway and being prepared to shoot multiple frames. So if you do have a kind of a particularly large or tricky subject, or just you want to experiment a bit, something like a car, you can shoot one frame where you're backlighting it, and then you can pick out a few details from the front, and then you can kind of merge those together in Photoshop using a light and blending mode, and you can quickly kind of, and it's actually one of those really fun things. When you start doing it, you start clicking the visibility of those layers on and off, and it's like you're switching different lights on and off, and you can kind of it sort of helps you understand what works and what doesn't, I think.
What I think you're basically talking about there, Kingsley, is cheating, right?
Cheating.
So because you can't get the picture right first time, so what you do is you take lots of average pictures and then stick them all together. Is that right?
That is it, yeah, very much. And also the scope of my the pictures that I want to make is obviously fantastically broader and more expansive than what you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, hopefully, Larry, that gives you some tips. I mean, do send us the results when they come through. It's definitely something that I myself want to have a go at as part of my sort of project in terms of shooting more at night, and I'd like to try and combine like a sort of a star traily type thing with a long exposure over a car or something like that.
One other thing actually I thought of when you were talking about not getting yourself lit up by the explosion of a flash, as your silhouette. Actually, you see a lot of people these days will go and put themselves deliberately in a picture, which can work really nicely, particularly if you've got like a great architectural background, but it's not quite working, and sometimes people put their own, they'll set everything up and then go and stand in there, and create these brilliant silhouettes, and it gives scale to these kind of things. But I'll stop butting in now.
Okay, so moving on to the next question then. I'll go to Will on this first. Bear in mind that Kingsley's rudely butting in on everything. It comes from Kate Thornley in Lowestoft, and she said, "I want to buy a new tripod and have set myself a £200 budget. Would the team recommend I spend it on a well-featured aluminium model or a smaller, lower specified carbon fibre one?"
Well, the first thing to say is the best tripod you can buy is the one that you're going to actually have with you. So that points me towards having a lighter tripod. So I am a big fan of carbon fiber. When they first came out, carbon fiber tripods were known to be brittle and they could crack when it got really cold. Of course, they're very, very expensive as well. But it seems as time's gone on, carbon fiber is much cheaper than it used to be. So I think you get a good carbon fiber tripod for 200 odd quid. Obviously, it depends on what you want to do with it. If you want to mount a big heavy camera and shoot maybe architecture and very long exposures, you probably want the heavier tripod in aluminium. But if you want a tripod, like I said, which I use for townscapes, I like to have one in the bag. I just buy a carbon travel tripod. And just to go off piece, just briefly, in the latest issue of Photography News, in fact, for the next 3 issues, we've got a K&F carbon fiber tripod to be won. So there's a thought. That's worth 120 quid. I mean, it's not the biggest tripod in the world, but actually, for its size and its heft and its price, it's really good value. But I think for 200 quid, you can buy a carbon fiber tripod. I mean, I've just quickly Googled Vanguard, and they've got a VO2, a 235CB carbon fiber tripod, and that's 180 quid with a head. So it depends on what you want to do with it. But I think if you don't need a huge height, or you don't want maximum stability in terms of doing super long exposures, I would suggest carbon fiber. But of course, Kingsley, being contrarian, we suggest aluminium.
I'm surprised he hasn't butted in so far. So anyway, let's give him an opportunity to have a say. Or have you got nothing to say now, Kingsley?
Well, I mean, it's the usual things, isn't it? You know, has it got 3 legs? Check the miles on it. Has it got a current MOT? That kind of thing. No, I think like Will says, carbon fiber tripods tend to be the more sensible choice if you intend to kind of be going anywhere with it. And carbon fiber tripods are a lot more affordable than they used to be. And you know, so I think it makes sense to sort of at least look in that route. And if you find that they're kind of it's too expensive or it's not doing something that you want, then just look kind of in the aluminium route. But I mean, apart from that, I know like this sounds slightly ridiculous for someone who wants buying advice on a specific thing, but like I think most photographers that you talk to you'll end up realizing they own more than one tripod, and probably for good reason, that they use them for different things. Or it might just be because they've got bored like Will does and buy another tripod because he likes the look of it. But I think that, you know, over time, if you're serious about your hobby, you'll probably end up with like a pretty lightweight travel tripod, something a bit heavier that you might want to use for long exposures close to home, you know, and you can tailor your tripod. It's like buying lenses. You tailor your tripod choice for the stuff you're going to do with it.
And I guess at this time of the year as well, if you're going to be using it outdoors, then I think, as Kingsley can stand testament to, having a carbon fiber tripod is a slightly less dangerous choice compared to an aluminium one. Maybe it's worth just revisiting that particular story, Kingsley.
This is I was shooting in Svalbard and it was -40, and I accidentally stuck my tongue out near a aluminium component of a tripod and got my tongue stuck to it for about sort of 5 worrying seconds, and then I realized I just pulled it off. It's fine.
It never gets old.
No. Fortunately, there wasn't a polar bear coming at the same time.
So, well, I hope that answers your question, Kate. Certainly, if you're going to Svalbard, it would appear that a carbon fiber tripod, although I doubt you're going to be going anywhere near there anytime soon. But I think that, generally speaking, the feeling is carbon fiber is the way forward, unless, of course, you are needing absolute stability and long exposures, in which case maybe the aluminium one would be the better one to choose. Good stuff. Thanks for that, chaps. Some good answers there. Well, I think we're kind of nearly done. But of course, we wouldn't end a Photography News podcast without a Will's word of wisdom. So go on, Will.
These camera straps that come with new cameras that are free, why are people using them? That's what staggers me. Maybe it's the fact I don't like to advertise my brand, but I'm just staggered that people use the camera straps and get provided with their camera when you can buy a better, more comfortable, more practical form of strap from the camera shop next time you're in there online. I mean, there are all sorts of different brands to go for. I mean, I'll pick out a couple. I've got an Eddy Cam strap, which is made from elk skin, which is really comfortable and tactile to the touch. I've also got a Black Rabbit strap, which is one of these so-called PAP straps or paparazzi straps, which runs across your body and the camera hangs down by your side. I've got a wrist strap, so I walk around and I want to shoot street work. I have the camera ready and I have a wrist strap so I don't drop it. But just why these people use their branded camera straps are going free with their camera, I just do not know. So my suggestion is get yourself a decent strap or two for different situations.
Excellent. Kingsley? Strapman? Are you strap man as well as torch man?
Actually, do you know? I mean, I think Will's completely right. When it's one of those kind of odd things that, if you think about it, it is a bit weird, isn't it? That everyone just uses the strap that comes with the camera. But I suppose I don't tend to use a strap that much because I tend to do most of my pictures on tripod, and like I don't know, I just don't kind of. And I'll quite happily carry the camera around like attached to the tripod.
So you don't need to have I thought you were going to be an advocate. Bearing in mind you are youthful, I thought that you were going to be one of these advocates of like one of these hipster straps that are actually neither use nor ornament because they're just big bits of rope and stuff like that.
No, actually, you've reminded me now. I've got a 1970s strap in my loft, which is currently attached to my Zenith camera, and it's one of those kind of those patterned straps.
Oh, beautiful!
Our straps, weren't they? Those wide 2-inch straps.
Yeah.
Looks like it should have been sat on an acoustic guitar. Is it that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think that brings us to the end of this 18th episode of the Photography News podcast. Thanks for your questions. Thanks for your ears for listening to us. And we will be back again in roughly 2 weeks' time when we'll have a roundup of the latest gear launches to chat about. So that just leaves me to say thank you very much to editor of Photography News, Mr. Will Chung. Thanks, Will.
A pleasure as always, guys. All the best.
And thanks also to the youthful Mr. 19-year-old Kingsley. So you've actually, do you know what, Kingsley? You've learned a lot about photography in 19 years. That's
Quick learner.
That's pretty good. Just go and learn about a Photoshop algorithm now. But thanks very much, Kingsley Singleton. Thank you, Kingsley.
Well, thanks very much to you too, chaps. It's very, very nice seeing everyone again.
I will see you again in a couple of weeks. Cheers now. Bye. This Photography News podcast is sponsored by MPB. Enjoy contact-free doorstep pickups which are safe, convenient, fully insured and completely free of charge. Plus, with 250,000 customers and 5 stars on Trustpilot, you can trust them and sleep easy.